a lovely, rainy, misty afternoon here in Colorado, and I am finally have a little time for a coffee talk this afternoon. It's Friday afternoon, but and a little bit past 3 o'clock, so I had to watch out what I put in my coffee. But here we are. So I want to talk about when libraries burn. I'm using my mug that one of my boys bought me at the Citizen Potawatomi family gathering. So it's the people to place the fire. Something. It's that mug. Some coffee in it. And I wanted to talk about when libraries burn. A couple of years ago, my friend Kevin Cullis was in the middle of writing a book, and he was also dying of cancer at the time. And he would say things like, he would just be talking about somebody. He said, well, whenever someone dies, it's like a library burns to the ground. And for him, that was absolutely true. He was like a library. He had researched so many books and things as he was thinking about how entrepreneurship works. And he had read a lot of books and thought deep thoughts about it. And so it was truly like a library burned when he passed away. And in an ironic sort of way, I did receive a few of his books that are now on my bookshelves over here after he passed away, and I'm grateful for those. One of those was, I think I have his Bible and a few of the other of his theological books that he had studied. But this whole concept for this talk today comes from the realization some time ago, and I forget, it wasn't that long ago. I was already at least in my late 30s, if not my early 40s, when I began to understand that when people would talk about the Library of Alexandria and how it had burned down, just exactly what that meant. So I started realizing at one point just how many books had been collected. And when I say books, I mean like scrolls, the writings, all of that stuff. And so what I didn't realize right away was just exactly when did this happen. And so, we have things like the sack of Constantinople in 1204, where just war comes in and destroys things, and later the fall of Constantinople, and just, there were libraries over there too, and some of those, we lost some things there every time this kind of stuff happened. And so in 48 BC, so roughly 50 years before the birth of Christ, Julius Caesar is over, and he's waging it's a civil war. He's waging it, but he ends up besieged at Alexandria. And so at Alexandria, there's this old library so the people over there in that part, in the northern part of Africa, in the Egyptian, like that whole section up there, they've been collecting wisdom for years, for generations. And so in 48 BC, when he is there, Julius ends up lighting the docks on fire and the ships in the docks on fire to try, part of his strategy. It's war, right? So they do all kinds of crazy stuff to destroy things during war times. And the fire, according to a few of his people, got a little out of hand and burned a few houses by the docks. But other people say, no, actually it burnt the Library of Alexandria, and 40,000 scrolls were destroyed. And so when I heard about this, 40,000 scrolls, that's a lot of written stuff. So what is in those scrolls? And so what can happen, and this is what happened to me, is I started thinking, well, we lost 40,000 scrolls in 48 BC. What is it that was in those scrolls? What don't we know today because we lost the scrolls, the 40,000 scrolls in the Library of Alexandria? And I actually got more interested in Alexandria and what was going on there. And through that process, I ended up reading this book, The African Memory of Mark. So this is talking about John Mark, and he became really the apostle to Alexandria and Libya, that whole surrounding area, to Africa. And so that's why when Thomas Oden was writing about John Mark, instead of just saying, well, here's what we know in the West about John Mark, he said, let's the African memory. And so he actually was able to access a lot of documents and writings from the early church fathers and others about from that time frame, and take into consideration what the folks who live there still say and have been saying for millennia about John Mark. And so this is a very fascinating book, by the way. It's like it says, it's reassessing early church tradition. So it's looking back at the early church tradition of who John Mark was and what he had to do. And he had a lot to do with Alexandria. But in the process of reading that book, I realized that because the gospel went to Alexandria so very quickly, in the lifetimes of the apostles, when the disciples were still alive, I mean, the gospel was in Alexandria like that. And because of that, the mindset of the Alexandrians at that time still was to treasure and store writings and documents, and so they did. And so what became later the Coptic Church and others, they had in their churches and their schools, the Christian churches and schools, they had massive libraries of writings and things. And some of those were never translated into English for any of us to read. And so sitting back, I'm thinking about my indignation that the Julius Caesar burned the 40,000 scrolls at the Library of Alexandria and just destroyed who knows what sort of history, right? Well, it's not good for me to then say, well, okay, I don't know stuff because some 2,000 years ago a library burned. What I need to say is, well, what do I have? And so that's what I actually I'm talking about today. Is I can be indignant over history and say, look what just happened, 40,000 scrolls gone. I don't even know what those scrolls were. Some of them might have been redundant. Some of them might have been useless. But imagine fussing about that while having on my own bookshelves, in my own space, unread books that I owned that I wasn't using. And so when I'm saying, if I could just have what would I do if I had access to those 40,000 scrolls? Do you know that right now, with my basic understanding of English, German, and a little bit of Spanish thrown in, there are probably very few of those scrolls that I could get anything out of. In fact, probably zero. And so if I went to the Alexandrian Library of 48 BC, or 50 BC, and was just transported there with a time machine, and you took me in and said, okay, Joseph, read away. The reality is, I couldn't read anything. The language is not mine. I don't know any of those languages. Meanwhile, not just here in my house, but here on my continent, and now with access to the World Wide Web, I can actually log into university libraries around the world and others where they've digitized things, and I have access to books that never before could one person sitting in one spot access so many different books. It's truly amazing. And so instead of railing over Julius Caesar for hey Elam, thanks for joining me today. So rather than just getting angry at at people in the past because they burned the books, I want to access the books I have. And so I started reading more books. Now, there's a time in your life when you just don't, like when you're a kid, you don't have time to read every book out there, and you don't want to necessarily. So you ask your parents, what books should I read? And so when I was a kid, I remember a few of the books I read were like this, The Who's Your Schoolboy. This is a book from 1897. Edward Eggleston, who's a teacher in Indiana. And, well, actually, I might have said that wrong because this was given to someone in December 25th of 95. But let me actually... Yeah, it was published in 1895, not 1897. And so this is a book. You can see there the inscription from Christmas Day 1895. So I love this book. And at some point, I read this book as a child, and then I got my own copy because my mom had it. So I loved it. There's a game in here called King's Base that is a description of Dare Base, the way the Amish still play it today. As a result, my Trail Life troop now plays King's Base and Dare Base because I use this to teach them some lesser known sports. As a kid, I remember as a young person, I read The Mile High Cabin. That was by Ruth Gibson Plowhead. Great book. Really enjoyed it. There's a whole series about the Little Colonel stories by Annie Fellows Johnston. I read a whole bunch of those. These were books that my mom had. And so what I learned in the process is that just because mom had the books didn't always mean that I liked them. But she at least had put some filters on to know that, okay, now I'm not going to just get out there and just read anything and hurt myself in the process. So that was great. And so as time goes on then, however, I had pretty much started reading all the books that mom had, or pretty close. I don't know if I've read all of them. This one, I can't find the cover for. This is the Brother Andrew book, the God Smuggler book. Absolutely amazing. If you can find that, Brother Andrew, God Smuggler, that's really worth reading. And hey, Ron, thanks for joining me from Mobile, Alabama. And so I kept reading as an adult, and I would end up going places and I'd find books. And so at one point, I read this book, The Killer Angels, and it's the book that the movie Gettysburg is based on. And I just absolutely love Michael Shara's way of writing, and so I really enjoyed this book. And then his son Jeff Shara took on where he left off, and Gods and Generals is based off of a book by that same name by his son. And then out of that, because I read Killer Angel and met Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and was like, who is this guy in history? I got his book, Joshua Chamberlain's book, Bayonet Forward. It says My Civil War Reminiscences, or Reminiscences. And so I got this book and just I enjoyed reading it too from a historical perspective. Well, then I'm also working on things like and I discovered this back in 2013. We sat down with my parents and I did the very first interviews for the project that came to be known as Breaking the Silence, My Amish Story. And so as I'm getting the stories from my parents and they're telling me things about our history and stuff, I had so many questions about the Amish, about the Mennonites and the Anabaptists and all of these things. And so as it would go, I would just be like, well, who has these answers? And at first I was thinking I have to physically interview or call anybody anywhere that has these. Hi, Bruce. We got a house full of kids today. Oh, Bruce is on, he's got rollerblades on. We've got some nieces and nephews here today, so the house is full. Anyway, I discovered that people have written a lot of books. And so one of the books I read back then was The Reformers and Their Stepchildren. I read that book. And that was part of my research for actually doing the Breaking the Silence. Another part of my research was the complete writings of Menno Simons. And so I don't know that I've ever read the complete writings, but I've gone through these and have read a lot and learned a lot, because you can talk all day about what Mennonites believe and why they believe it and who said what and what Menno Simons believes. But if you actually just read it, you can know this is what he said. And that's better than just conjecturing. So I discovered I can do my own research. Now, in the process of doing research, I also discovered that there are times, and I don't have one of them here with me, but what I discovered was that when I'm doing research, I will find some books that are better at the research than others, and there are some books that are not well documented. So, for instance, there is a book about, and I don't have a copy here, but I got my hands on it at one point and was reading through it. But it has to do with how Easter is named after the Greek god Ishtar, and it goes on and on and on. Anyway, as it goes through all of this stuff, none of the guy's ideas or thoughts are actually documented properly. He's just making it up. And then there's this other book that heavily that references his book. And so when you read the second book, you feel, oh, well, he's documenting it. Well, what is he documenting? He's documenting another book that was not documented. And so I have learned to really appreciate it when someone is writing and then they give me a bibliography and they say, here's what I am writing about. And so when they, either at the end of the chapter or just footnotes at the bottom, if they just in some way let me know what they were referencing, it sure helps me out a bunch. So I will, when I'm reading a book, I will look for the footnotes, I will look for the sources, and sometimes I'll go back and read those sources. And so that was how I think some months ago, I did a coffee talk about George Mueller and how he had read a book by Brother Frank, and how I finally went looking for the book by Brother Frank, and there it was. It's in German, which is why we don't have it in English, never got translated, but I found a copy of it, and I was able to read it, and I was like, wow, George Mueller was inspired by this guy for the orphanages. Very similar stories, just a much earlier time frame, and in Germany instead of in England. And so books are such a blessing because you get to hear someone else's ideas. Sometimes as you're reading them, you're like, no, I don't think this is right. And that's what I wanted to understand. I found a bunch of books, like this book, for instance. I found God in Soviet Russia. I found so many stories of people who, during the Soviet Russia time frame, were imprisoned for various reasons. Either they were already Christians or they become Christian while they're imprisoned. And so I started reading more and more of these. Well, I eventually found some that were not actually historical, that someone had just been writing some novels. And one of those was pretty bad. And I just remember going, okay, I really do prefer true history when people just tell the truth, not this novels and fantasizations that people come up with. And so it is true that as you start reaching out for more and more books, you will run into some bad stuff. I also remember at the time in my teens, I was about 15 years old, I had read a bunch of books by Harold Bell Wright. This one, In the Eyes of the World, was one of my absolute favorites at the time. I loved it. The Sky Pilot by Ralph Connor was another one of those that I just absolutely enjoyed. These were books that my mom had introduced me to. And so then, because these were considered novels, other people would bring us boxes and boxes of books. And so some of these would be newer, some of the older. But I remember one day, Mom, this was when we lived in Glen Lake, out in Montana, and when we lived on Glen Lake Road, and Mom said, here, there are several boxes of books. We got to take them out to the road so the trash will pick them up when they go by. And I'm like, you're just going to throw books in the trash? Like, books? Books are awesome. And so I remember carrying the books out, setting them beside the road, and I didn't have any other work to do at the moment, or else I was just shirking. I don't remember. I just remember picking up a book from the top. I opened it to a random page, and I read this very, sex scene romance novel. It, in my mind, it was like pornography level stuff, right? And I was shocked because I hadn't read any books that did that kind of descriptiveness. And so I finally understood why Mom was getting rid of the whole box. She was like, no, they're not worth taking to the restore. They're not worth reselling. We just got to get rid of them. They're bad books. Because there are artists, and even in this book, The Eyes of the World, Harold Bell Wright has a character in here who is an author who in his time, so in the early 1900s, is writing this sort of trash stuff. There are so many trash books that are just suspense or thrillers or romance, and they're just designed to hook you in and make you want to read the next one, what's going, and you don't actually learn anything. It's not good for your intellect. It's not good for your imagination. It just sets you up with wrong expectations for life. It does not help you in your personal walk with the Lord. They're just trash. And so there are some libraries that might need to be burned. Although I'm not big on just burning tons of books, right? What I am big on is discovering who writes books that are worthy of me consuming them so that I can actually read and learn something. So that's part of what I'm doing when I share my books with you, is I am learning, I'm sharing my favorite books so that if you're looking for books to read, here's a few. So, in the idea of the Library of Alexandria, what I did discover is that in many of our church history classes, we talk about the birth of Christ, we talk about the life of the Apostle Paul, and then somewhere with Paul or John, the Apostle John, we kind of drop off of history and we hardly talk about anything else. Currently, there's a trend in a lot of more conservative churches where I will hear people and they will blame stuff like on Constantine. They'll say, well, that happened because of Constantine. And they'll blame all kinds of stuff on Constantine. Things like the fact that many, many churches around the world gather on Sundays to worship the Lord. They'll blame Constantine for not having kept the Jewish things. And so if you read for a little bit, you discovered, oh, this was something way before Constantine came on board, that there were Christians that were celebrating Sunday as the resurrection of the Lord. They were celebrating the resurrection of Christ on the day of the week in which it had happened, the first day of the week. And so it helps to read. But what I discovered was, for most of us, when we're given church history, we focus on the last 500 years. There's 1,500 years before that. We call it the Dark Ages, and sometimes it means there was nothing written. But there was a lot written. The couple hundred years after Christ, as people were coming to Jesus, surrendering to God, they were being filled with the Holy Spirit, there was a lot of stuff written. And a lot of it is actually still accessible to us today. It's just not what we're told to study. This book, actually here, the works of Josephus, a lot of people know about because, he's a historian, and we kind of have suspicions that there are places that he kind of stretched a little bit, or he made himself look a little bit better. Hey, Sarah. Awesome. Yeah, I love George Mueller's stories. His book, I read that thing, one of his, by his son-in-law. I read that book over and over again when I was first trying to understand how to pray and walk with the Lord. So back on Josephus, works of Josephus, that's like early, this is secular history that talks about Christ in those time frames, basically. Okay. Around the turn of the century, from the 200s into the 300s, this fellow, Eusebius, was working on an ecclesiastical history. And so he's just writing through here. He's explaining a whole bunch of things from the church's perspective, what happened, who the different leaders were in different churches, and he just writes a lot of stuff. What I found absolutely fascinating about this is that the guy that this one, C.F. Cruz, when he translated, I have two translations because I was just curious. These translations are about 100 years apart. So I have Paul L. Meyer, who just did it in the last decade or two, and then this guy, Cruz, who did it during the late 1800s. So what was fascinating to me, because we have all of these books and things handed down to us from the Reformation time frame on. So like we have books from Calvin and Luther and Zwingli and Menno Simons, and then you go over to, you have John Knox, you have a whole bunch of people over in England, you have all of these writings. And we don't, for the most part, if it's got their name on it, we don't question, doubt it. We just say, yep, that's what he wrote. Well, here's Eusebius. We have his manuscripts in a bunch of different languages. It was translated to different languages. It was kept in different libraries. We have a lot of these copies. We can be pretty sure that whatever it is pretty accurate. However, he reports on several things that seem pretty fantastic to our modern way of thinking. And so Cruz here, one of the things he just said was that if at one point he's like, we thought that he was just making stuff up. But then we discovered, there is someone else in another person who was writing also mentions this. And so we don't think, maybe they're active, what they're remembering is actually maybe it didn't happen, but maybe the king who caused the record to be written, maybe he made it up. And so here's, I have just a moment. I'll just tell you the quick story that was in this is Eusebius history that he was talking about. So he says that there was a king on the other side of the Nile. No, sorry, the Euphrates. There was a king of a little kingdom on the other side of the Euphrates that heard about Jesus and heard about what was going on in the time of Christ and the healings, and he himself was sick and his son was sick. And so he sends a letter by a servant of his named Nicodemus. I might have their names wrong. I should have read it if I was going to talk about it. Anyway, not Nicodemus. I can't remember the guy's name. he sends, or Ananias, that's who it was. He had a servant named Ananias. He sends a letter to Jesus, gets a letter back from Jesus. And so it's in the court records of this king on the other side of the Euphrates where he says, here's the letter I sent, and this is the letter I got back. And Jesus basically said, I'm about my Father's business. Thank you for reaching out to me. I have to stay here and finish what I've started. After my death, I will send someone to you to take care of you. And so sometime later, it's according to the king's records, Apostle Thomas sent a man named Thaddeus, who is one of the 70, and sends him over to that country. As he comes into the country, he's talking with people, he's healing people, he's preaching the gospel. The king hears about him and says, hey, come to my court. He comes to the court, he heals him, and he says, now tell me all about Jesus. And so he's telling the king about Jesus. The king says, hold on just a second. Let's have a citywide festival and let's have everyone come and listen and you tell them. So he preached in one day to all the people in the city the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so the city in which this happened did have an early church presence for several hundred years afterward. It was a pretty strong influence. But what was interesting was Cruz automatically assumed that wouldn't be true. Why? Because Jesus wrote a letter. That was why. And so he decided that the king himself must have been trying to make some fame for himself and wrote, and not the king that it happened to, but one of the later kings, once Christianity was spreading, was like, hey, I'm going to go back and doctor up the records so that I can be famous, or something like that. That was his theory. And my question is, if other people write such things in other time frames, we don't doubt it like that as much. And so I've been trying to understand, why is there, when it has to do with the early church, why do we have so much doubt so fast? And especially with something like this where it fits. Like there was nothing that was written in the letter from Jesus that didn't fit with Jesus. There was nothing that Thaddeus said that didn't fit with the way the early church, the apostles preached the gospel. And so anyhow, I have a lot more books to read. And, whether you're looking for just some entertainment or whether you're looking for some history, maybe, this is awesome history here. Whoa. Or if you're just looking for a way to think about your own faith and journey, this is a book that some of the guys at church and I are going through right now. It's called Fighting Shadows, Overcoming 7 Lies That Keep Men from Becoming Fully Alive. It's pretty cool. We're talking about loneliness right now and how loneliness is not supposed to just be part of our life, but there's something we can do about it. So don't just be sad because somebody somewhere burned some books. Go read something. It's a whole portal into another person's soul, another person's viewpoint, another time frame in history. There's so much to be learned. And in the process of doing so, you will learn so many things that when you die, your children and grandchildren will say, it's like burning down a library when he passed away. Yes, that's what it's like. So those are my thoughts for this misty, rainy, kind of chilly August afternoon in Colorado. I will see you guys hopefully next week. I'm in the middle of a house painting project again, so my days are a little more crowded than before. But hopefully I'll be back next week and we can chat some more. Thanks for joining me today. Blessings.